So now that we have our reducer listening for the backend update to store the actual collections value, we don't need this initial state and this shop data that we have in our front end anymore. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to remove shop data. And we're even going to delete the shop data file because we don't need it anymore. And then what we'll do is we're going to set our initial collections value to null. By doing this, we'll actually run into a couple new issues with how we've set up our application. In fact, we should see an error right away when we go to our application, right? There's two errors on the page. The first is that our selector is expecting that an object exists because we cannot convert, right, this value with object keys on null. So what we got to do in our selector is we have to go and make it so that it knows that if this collections is a null object, right, then we want to return something different. So here we're saying if collections exists, then call object keys. If it's false, right, if it doesn't, if it's null, then instead what you want to return is an empty version of our collections, which in this case will be just an empty array. And now if we go back to our application, we'll see that the error is fixed. Now, the other issue we're going to encounter is when we go to our collection page. If we select this and we refresh, we'll see that we run into the problem where we cannot read the property women's of null. Because as you remember, inside of our selector, we receive a collection URL parameter, and then we start to look inside of our collections map object to find the corresponding collection object and pass it through to our collection page component. So right now, not only is our selector having a problem, but it's also having an issue with the way that there's no collection that's passing through. So one thing we're going to have to be aware of is what we do if there is a null value for our collections object. Well, in this case, if this collections object does not exist, then what we want to return is the similar thing to what we wrote above. If collections exists, then return collections with the collection URL param. If it doesn't, then we're just going to return null. It's better we return null, or we can just return collections because we know it's null, but it's more explicit this way. It's better we return null so that the components that use the selector will get a null object, and naturally they themselves will know, oh, okay, there's no data here, right? There's nothing here, so I'm just going to render an empty state if I need to. And then what we do inside of our actual component now, we'll see that we are getting title and items of a null value, right? Which is fine because our application is going to be in the state where a collection could possibly be null. The reason is because when our app first boots up and this collection page mounts, it's going to look inside the reducer and try and find a collections map that we have. However, because we have not received the data back yet from our backend, because that search, as we know, is asynchronous, our app can possibly be in a state where the data does not exist. So we have to create what's called a loading state. And in this loading state, what we want to do is actually render a spinner of some kind, right? You know those typical loading spinners that you see when the data is trying to come in? Well, we want to render something like that. So what we'll do is actually leverage a couple high-end concepts that we've already done before in order to build this spinner. Let's actually just do that first. So the first thing we'll do is we will build a spinner component. But that component we want to be able to reuse. So we're going to use the higher order component pattern that we've explored before. Now, this might be a little bit confusing as we write this, but I promise you that I will explain every step of it again after we've written it, also while we're writing it. So first, we're going to make a new folder called with spinner. Now, inside of our with spinner, we are going to make our with spinner.component.jsx. So this will be our higher order component. We're also going to make our with spinner.styles.jsx. And now what we're going to do is we are going to create our style objects, right? So our styled components. Now I already have them for you, so you can just copy them in. And they leverage some CSS keyframe animations in order to do the actual spinning animation. I'm not going to spend any time to explain it because it requires its own dedicated lesson on CSS. And that is a pretty lengthy lesson, to be honest. So because there's so much we have to cover, I'm just going to move past this. And if you would like to learn more about animations, there's numerous articles written about just the basics of how to write a CSS animation. But what we'll do is we're actually going to build out our now with spinner higher order component. So we got to import React from React and import in these two style components that we just made. One is the overlay and one is the spinner itself. The overlay just makes sure that our spinner is always centered. So we got to import in our spinner container and our spinner overlay from our new with spinner styles. And now we're going to declare our with spinner higher order component, which takes some component, right? Which we're going to call our wrapped component. And then, as you remember, with any higher order component, it returns you back a new functional component. So in fact, let's just write the component itself. We're going to write a component that gets an isLoading property, and then every other property that our regular component that is being wrapped will expect. And then this component will render either our spinner, depending on this isLoading property, right? Whether or not it's going to be true or false. So isLoading is going to be a property that only takes a Boolean value. If it's true, so if loading is true, we want to render our spinner component. So we're going to have our spinner overlay and then our spinner container, and that's our spinner component. If loading is false, then we want to return the wrapped component that we had, except we're going to pass it every other prop except for the isLoading prop. And then we'll export default our with spinner component. Now, if this is a little confusing, let's just go over this again. What we're doing is we're making a new with spinner component, right? Higher order component. It's a function that takes some component that we want to wrap with the functionality of our spinner loading feature. And that wrapped component gets passed into this new component that wraps around it, right? This one right here. And then what it does is it determines, based on an isLoading property that gets passed into this component, if it's loading, render my spinner overlay. If isLoading is false, then just render the component that we passed in as normal, receiving all the props that it would receive. Now, if we want to make this more explicit, we could actually write it like this. We can set this equal to a const spinner, right? So it's just like our regular components. And then what we'll do is we just have to make sure to return outside our spinner. So this way now we know what we're getting back from this higher order component is a spinner component, a functional spinner component. And you just use it the same way that you would use your wrapped component. The only difference is that if you want to render the spinner, you use the isLoading prop and pass it a Boolean value that will conditionally render the spinner or our component. One thing we have to consider is how we're going to use this with spinner component. You might think that the place where it's causing the error is the collection page. So let's put our with spinner on the collection page. And this is not necessarily incorrect. However, because our shop page is actually going to be our shop component is going to be the component that actually will be able to know whether or not the loading state that we're considering is actually finished, because the shop component is the one that actually receives and makes the call to update our reducer after getting the data back from our backend. Then due to this reason, we have to put the logic for determining the with spinner on our shop component. And I'll show you how we'll do that in the next lesson.